The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred from October 15th to October 28th, 1962. The leaders of the three main countries involved in the conflict were John F. Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev, and Fidel Castro. This conflict started because Cuba, once an ally of the U.S., turned to communism, therefore becoming an enemy of USA. This conflict was the only time in history that the world came this close to nuclear war. Due to this, the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the scariest conflicts in history, bringing the world the closest it's ever been to nuclear war, and due to mutually assured destruction, the nations came up with a compromise that ended the threat of nuclear war for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Even though the nations were all enemies, they had a sense of morality to come up with peace, whatever sacrifice they had to make.
Since this was such a short conflict, there weren't many people involved. Mainly from America, it was John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was the 35th President of the United States of America and the President during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Robert Kennedy was the 64th Attorney General of the United States. He had a very large impact on the compromise. From the Soviet Union was Nikita Khrushchev, Anatoly Dobrinin, and Vasily Arkhipov. Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union during the crisis. Anatoly Dobrinin was ambassador and diplomat, and he had a major part in the compromise. Vasily Arkhipov was a Soviet Navy officer during the Cold War, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. From Cuba was mainly Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was the dictator of Cuba and brought communism to Cuba.
There were many moments that sparked the conflict, but the main event that started this conflict occurred before this crisis. It was the invasion called the Bay of Pigs. This invasion was when Cuba had turned to communism and the U.S. invaded it because Cuba had become a threat. The invasion failed, and it encouraged Cuba to seek help from the Soviet Union. Due to this, the Soviet Union started sending ballistic missiles to Cuba, starting the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The moment when the conflict reached its climax was when the Soviet Union was angered because the U.S. sent a quarantine around Cuba. Due to this, Khrushchev responded with a letter that says, "The violation of freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression which pushes mankind to the abyss of world nuclear missile war." That action caused the U.S. to realize that this conflict would not be resolved with just a quarantine, and that there was a real threat of nuclear war. In our interview with Professor Eric Johnson, he explained that the American citizens were scared because America tended to see the Soviet menace as either veiled, such as subversion at home, spies, or the concept of brainwashing, or remote, such as threats to the U.S. prestige, allies, and global leadership overseas. Before the Cuban Missile Crisis and after the crisis, they saw the Soviet Union as a threat to their actual lives, and that the Cold War has a real chance of devastating them and their country. The government thought like that as well, and decided to move to DEFCON 2, one step away from nuclear war. This is the closest the world has ever been to nuclear war.
This conflict was told to the people in detail by John F. Kennedy in his briefing about the Cuban Missile Crisis. He explained about how the Soviet Union was putting missiles in Cuba. At one point, John F. Kennedy said missiles are capable of hitting most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson Bay, Canada, and as far south as Lima, Peru. He later explained that all about how the U.S. would quarantine the prison island of Cuba. That brought lots of fear and protest. Many American families saw the true threat of the nuclear war for the first time. The press made many articles about this, and America grew very timid by all of John F. Kennedy's later moves because they knew their lives will most likely depend on it. The closest time the world was to nuclear war was when the U.S. sent a small depth charge to signal a Soviet sub to come up to the surface. Too deep to communicate to the surface, the commanders thought war had begun and prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. To do that, they needed an unanimous 3 votes from 3 naval officers. 2 of them agreed to shoot the torpedo, but Vasily Arkhipov, the second highest ranking member, voted against it. However, if the torpedo was shot out, the conflict may have escalated and a compromise would not have been reached. That is why Vasily Arkhipov was given many awards for his action for years to come after the crisis. In our interview, we discussed this topic, and Professor Eric Johnson said, "If a nuclear torpedo had been used to destroy 1 or more U.S. ships, it seems very likely U.S. forces would have deployed tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. In that case, it seems quite possible that 1 or more of the Soviet missiles in Cuba would have been launched at the U.S. mainland, or that the Soviet Union would have seized Berlin, or undertaken some other dramatic escalation. If those things had happened, then a strategic nuclear exchange seems probable."
This conflict didn't have a compromise easily. Both sides wanted too much from each other, and they seemed unable to reach a compromise. However, Robert Kennedy and Anatoly Dobrynin had a secret meeting and found their way for compromise. Yet, John F. Kennedy was unable to agree to the compromise because Nikita Khrushchev added that he must take down his Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy. Later, though, John F. Kennedy found no other option and agreed to the compromise, and the conflict was finally over. The compromise was that the U.S. would take down its Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy and promised to never invade Cuba, while the Soviet Union had to take down its ballistic missiles in Cuba with UN inspection. The compromise was good enough to end nuclear war, but many people from all sides found many faults within the compromise. Many Americans became very angered because they saw that John F. Kennedy negotiated with the enemy. Many government officials didn't like that there was a compromise because most wanted to end the conflict with military actions. Most people in the Soviet Union believed that Nikita Khrushchev lost the compromise. People on both sides became very angry with their leaders, but as Professor Eric Johnson said in the interview, given those circumstances, it seems a very reasonable compromise. Any price from either side may be said to have paid off and was surely well worth it for the avoidance of nuclear war.
The Cuban Missile Crisis made everyone scared about nuclear war to a new extent. As Professor Eric Johnson explained, after the crisis, the 2 respective spheres of vital interest became more clearly defined, and both the US and the USSR became more cautious about violating them. The USSR appeared less interested in embracing confrontation, and the US seemed more accepting of the idea of the nuclear parity between both countries. In this conflict, both countries could have wiped the other off of the face of the earth with the push of a button. But because of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, that prompted both sides to resolve the conflict. They ended the conflict with a peace treaty in which stated that the United States would remove its missiles in Turkey and Italy, and that the Soviet Union would remove their missiles from Cuba. This incident was a very horrifying conflict that would have brought an end to the world as we know it, but thanks to the compromise and mutually assured destruction, the world was saved from nuclear war. In conclusion, the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the best ways to show conflict and compromise, because Robert Kennedy and Anatoly Dobrynin agreed on a compromise to end the conflict of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Without the compromise between Robert Kennedy and Anatoly Dobrynin, the conflict would have endangered the entire world. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a great example of conflict and compromise in history.